Our speaker this evening is Dr. Darrick Taylor, a professor of humanities at Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida. Dr. Taylor received his Ph.D. from the University of Kansas. He produces a podcast, Controversies in Church History, and recently completed his first novel. He writes essays for Catholic periodicals, including Crisis Magazine, 1 Peter 5, and Inside the Vatican. Please join me in welcoming for the first time to the Institute of Catholic Culture, Dr. Darrick Taylor.
Thank you. Glad to be here. All right. I guess we're ready to go. So I'll start if you guys are ready to start.
Wonderful. Open us in prayer, and the floor is all yours.
Father, and Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Dear Heavenly Father, you have sanctified us by the blood of your Son and redeemed us in his name. And we ask that you, in this time we have together, may listen and learn together what you have revealed to us in the events of history in which your church has journeyed through the ages, and learn thereby to more worthily magnify the name of thy Son. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, I guess I'll just start here. And so I want to thank everyone for showing up. Thank you for listening to this talk. And the lecture tonight is on, you get the title, Kulturkampf, the Dismantling of German Catholicism. And the Kulturkampf, as historians call it, is the efforts, or were the efforts by the German Empire in the 1870s, from about 1871 to 1878, to legally subordinate the Catholic Church in Germany to the German state. There were attempts to, curb its abilities to communicate with Rome. There were attempts to gain control over clerical appointments. It seized church property. It exiled bishops. It is a full-scale legal attack on the autonomy of the Catholic Church in Germany. And so we want to do tonight is explain, okay, why did the German state do this? What is this about, and how does this come about? And to understand why, you're going to have to understand the several decades prior that lead up to this in the 1870s. Because both the church and the German state, as it emerges in that period, are both dealing with the effects of modernity, of all the changes that take place in the 19th century, nationalism, nationalist revolts, which overthrow older arrangements of church and state, industrialization, which of course reshapes European society over the case of a century, of the 19th century. And the church especially has to come to terms with this. It's difficult because, of course, it had been an integral part of that older order. It had leaned on the support of states, absolute monarchies prior to the great revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. And for our purposes tonight, particularly the revolutions of 1848, there are a series of revolutions in that year, starting in Paris, spreading to most European capitals, which overthrow a lot of the regimes that were restored after the Napoleonic Wars. And this particularly touches the church because Pius IX, who was the Pope at the time, is literally driven from Rome. He is driven, he runs out of that fear for his life. He's only restored a year later by French troops. He is still the ruler of a kingdom, the Papal States, in 1848, and yet he's dependent on foreign powers to keep himself in that position. And all of these forces that have overthrown the old order and that are driving toward creating nation states, right? A national unification, the Risorgimento in Italy, the drive to unify all the states in Italy into one state. They all have a real virulent streak of anti-clericalism within them. And this is one of the things that the church is reacting to in the several decades before the Kulturkampf. This is a moment in which militant liberalism as a sort of ideology really rears its head. You have those adherents of that political philosophy, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, when you do have the establishment of nation states, modern nation states, and you have them stripping away the various privileges and rights the church used to have in a lot of these states. There are two flashpoints where the church comes into conflict with states all over Europe, not just in Germany, which is on two things. One, marriage. There's a drive to make marriage a purely civil matter in most countries, and then control of education. and the church is fighting pretty much, I won't ruin it for you. I will ruin it for you, a losing battle. They will lose control of education in these countries. They know how important this is. But in response to all these forces, the church really has to modernize itself. Not necessarily, I don't say, I think I gave you an outline, part of which says Pius IX modernizer. I meant to be kind of tongue in cheek. He's not a modernist. He doesn't mean update the church's teachings, but update the way it sort of relates to society. Remember before, they could always depend on the state to support it. They can't do that anymore. And so what happens is the church becomes something like a sort of populist institution in the 19th century. It has to appeal to the masses, to the people. And so the church begins taking advantage of things it had never really done before, like the press. The church had always seen the printing press as the sort of engine of destruction that the Protestant Reformation had used to try to undermine it. But in the wake of all these revolutions, in the wake of all these attacks on its authority, it has to make use of the popular press. And it does become popular. I mean, particularly the church, but the papacy. This is very new. Most of you grew up in an age where you see popes on TV. They go somewhere. There are large crowds reading them and stuff like this. This is a product of the 19th century. Popes were not popular figures like that before the 19th century. They become so because there is this need on the part of a lot of these populations in Europe that are enduring all these, great changes, all these upheavals. And they look to the papacy for support in these times. And so in addition to the Catholic press, which you have Catholic newspapers being started all over Europe, you have the Vatican itself, L'Osservatore Romano, I believe it started in the 1860s, Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit newspaper started in the 1850s. They realize they have to appeal to public opinion in order to bolster its authority. And so the Pope becomes a popular figure for the first time. And Pius IX, by the way, is perfectly suited to this. He's very charismatic. He's charming. He would have made a great, I think, a media pope, a modern media pope. He would have been good for sound bites and stuff like this. But you have this modernization going toward, in the service of what I'm calling a sort of counter-revolution from below. Pius IX, after his experience in the revolutions of 1848, wants to fight back. He wants to push back on all these modernizing trends. He issues famously the encyclical Quanta Cura in 1864, which is attached to the Syllabus of Errors, where he condemns things like freedom of the press, liberalism, modern society, which, again, sort of earns him a bad reputation among European liberals, to put it bluntly. But he is riding the wave of a serious religious revival that's going on in Europe in the 1850s and 60s. There was a revival all across Italy, France, Germany as well. The revival of religious orders. This is the great age of parish missions, goes along with this. Pilgrimages become sort of commonplace all across Europe. This is also the beginning. We're still living through it, actually. The great age of Marian apparitions, of course. Lourdes in 1858, Knock in Ireland in 1879, Fatima later on in the 20th century. But there are actually hundreds of sightings of the Virgin Mary, appearances reported in the 19th century, some of which happened during the Kulturkampf in Germany. And they actually become, I won't talk about this too much later to try to save time, but it becomes a point of controversy during the Kulturkampf, if you can imagine. And so you have this revived, it's sometimes called ultramontane Catholicism, ultramontanism. Ultramontane means literally beyond the mountains, because people are looking beyond the Alps to the Pope to appeal to him. That exalts the authority of the papacy, and he is, and the scholars criticize this today, but there is a centralization of authority in his hands, which virtually everybody's in favor of. Again, you have a lot of nation states that are kind of hostile to the church. Everyone's looking to the papacy, and he becomes the sort of focus of this in ways he hasn't been before. Excuse me. And so you have the church on the one hand responding to these changes. You also have these changes affecting the state of Prussia, which will be the German kingdom that's kind of the driver behind German unification in the 19th century. And actually, Becky, could you show me the first map I want to show them? This is to explain what Prussia is, where it is in Germany, if you don't know what this is. Yeah, thank you. This is a map of what we call Germany in 1815. In fact, it's called the German Confederation. because before 1871, there is no Germany as a state. It's always been multiple states. Before the Napoleonic Wars, there were something like 400 states in what was called the Holy Roman Empire. After the Napoleonic Wars, it's reduced to about 40 or so. But it is a place where it's a set of states. They all have a similar culture. They all speak German. They all have a German culture. They have no political unity. And it's something that, because of the Napoleonic Wars, produces a real desire for the Germans to have one state, one people. And I said before, Prussia, and you can see them in the north there, in the north here, they have a sort of discontinuous state. The western part here, over here on the right is the eastern parts of Prussia. Prussia is essentially a military state. It's the Protestant Sparta of Europe. It's ruled by a divine right monarch and a service nobility of aristocrats called the Junkers, who provide the sort of military caste for this state, which Napoleon Bonaparte once said was hatched from a cannonball in the 18th century. And they are affected by the revolutions of 1848 as well, because you have this challenge to the authority of the monarchy. The Prussian military puts it down fairly easily, this revolution. However, there is a growing sort of liberal bourgeoisie in Prussia, which the monarch has to placate. And so he's forced to provide a constitution for Prussia in 1850, as well as a parliament which doesn't have a whole lot of powers. And yet, giving these liberals, and liberals are nationalists, by the way, in the 19th century for the most part, it feeds nationalist ideas in Prussia as in elsewhere. And one of the things to note about this, especially in Prussia, German nationalism is very much a modernizing project. A lot of these people dreamed of having this unity from the time they were defeated by Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. But from the 1840s onwards, German nationalists saw unification as something that was part of their destiny. I'll give you an example. One historian said of German nationalists in the 1840s that, quote, they saw Germany as, quote, the country of the future that would defend itself against the Romanism of France and the Slavism of Russia by becoming an industrial giant with an invincible army and a superior culture, unquote. So even a couple of decades ahead, you have German nationalists who are pushing for this. And they see themselves in very much modernizing terms. Prussia, after the Revolution of 1848, does modernize its bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, begins modernizing its military. And it will come into conflict with the resurgent Catholicism in the 1860s. In Germany, in Prussia, there are anti-clerical riots in the decade leading up to the Kulturkampf in places like Baden. There was also a serious attack on a Catholic orphanage, in 1869 in a place called Malaba. It's a suburb of Berlin, industrial suburb, in which a crowd of about 1,000 people descends on this Franciscan orphanage and just storms through and starts smashing windows, smashing doors. The priests flee with the kids, by the way, they get away. But this is usually seen by historians as a precursor to the Kulturkampf, because you have this revival of Catholicism. You have to remember there hadn't been religious orders in parts of Prussia since God knows when. They haven't seen them in decades at least. And they're very alien. They have very prejudiced notions about who they are. The press is very important in all this, by the way, in understanding the Kulturkampf, because there's a lot of stereotypes that get resurrected about, again, religious orders, a lot of rumors. One of the reasons why that crowd attacks the orphanage is because they've heard press reports about nuns being buried alive in monasteries and stuff like this, and all sorts of horror stories. And so it dredges up prejudice, as a lot of people thought had gone away. It's worth noting that in the 1860s, by the 1860s, Protestant practice is on the decline in Germany as a whole and in Prussia. So they see a resurgent Catholicism, both in social and religious terms, as kind of a threat in a lot of ways. In any event, what happens in the 1860s is that Prussia will emerge as the great power in Germany to unite all those states into one state. And the man who's most responsible for this, and the man who's most responsible for the Kulturkampf, is a man named Otto von Bismarck. And he's sometimes called the Iron Chancellor. And he was a member of this Junker class, this sort of military caste in Prussia. And what happens is he's basically kind of, in 1848, he's just a basic reactionary. Most of these junkers are fairly reactionary types. They don't want to make any compromises with nationalist elements in the country. But he becomes an ambassador for about a decade or so before the 1860s. And what happens is in the 1860s, by the time you get to the 1860s, there's an impasse between the Prussian monarch and his parliament. The liberals in parliament want more say, they want more control, they want more democracy. The king, by the way, who very much believes himself to be a divine right monarch, he thinks his authority comes directly from God. He thinks ceding these people any authority is just wrong. And so to try to break the impasse, he recalls Otto von Bismarck from his post to come and be his chancellor. And for the next 30 years or so, he will guide Prussia and then Germany into becoming the greatest power on the continent. And just a couple of things about, hopefully somebody have heard of Otto von Bismarck before. If you haven't, he is, well, first of all, he's a pietist Lutheran. That is to say, he's a sort of evangelical Lutheran. He was married for 47 years, very happily from all accounts. He could be a fairly crude and verbally abusive person. He once said, anybody know what Bavaria is? Bavaria is a state in Germany. It's actually where Pope Benedict XVI is from, right? He once said of Bavarians, this is Otto von Bismarck, that they were, quote, a cross between human beings and Austrians. He once said of socialists in the 1870s that they are, quote, this country's rats and should be exterminated. He did inject a very awful discourse into German politics. However, he was also, after Napoleon Bonaparte, probably the most brilliant political figure in 19th century Europe. He learned a lot as his stay as an ambassador, and he used it to turn Prussia into a great power, which was on no one's radar in 1862. Prussia was kind of the fifth great power. Basically, no one thought they were going to become the great power in Europe or unify Germany behind them. And so what happened in this sort of impasse between the Prussian king and his parliament was Bismarck got around this deadlock. Because they wouldn't, what happened was the king wanted more money for his military reforms. The parliament said no, give us more control of the military. He said no, that's my divine right to do that. And they wouldn't pass a budget, so there was no money. And so Bismarck had this great idea to basically say that, well, there's a gap in the Constitution where it doesn't say what we have to do. And so he said, we're just going to go on collecting revenues according to the old budget and fund the army that way, which he did, which infuriated the people in the parliament, made his king very happy. In the meantime, what he did to try to get those elements behind him was he used the Prussian military to win wars. In 1862, he goes to war with Denmark in concert with Austria, makes an alliance, defeats them. And then 2 years later, and this is the big victory that they had in the 1860s, he provokes a war with Austria. And Austria, if you saw on the map, is sort of at the southern end of what was called Germany. It's the great Catholic power in this German Confederation. And of course, Austria has been involved in Germany since it's existed as a state, right? This is the Habsburg dynasty. There's still Habsburgs around, by the way. You can see them on Twitter and stuff like this. But what happens is he provokes a war with Austria, and within, I think, 4 weeks, they defeat them in a lightning campaign, completely crush the Austrian army. And this revolutionizes things, because all of a sudden, one of the things Bismarck does, several German states ally with Prussia. He annexes their territory. Hey, you fought with the losers. You have to become part of Prussia now. And it sends a signal to basically the treaty basically excludes Austria from Germany thereafter for the first time in its history. So he kicks Austria out of Germany. And more than this, he does something that shocks his comrades. In 1867, he throws in with the liberals in parliament and gives them a brand new constitution, which gives them, among other things, universal manhood suffrage, a lower parliament in which they can veto bills, and effectively throws in his lot. It basically imposes democracy, right? Now, why would he do this? His whole goal, along with the emperor, the king of Prussia, is to maintain the power of this military caste, this divine right monarchy. What he does effectively is impose a sort of nationalist revolution from above. Bismarck's a very cagey politician. He knows this is coming anyway. Well, if it's going to come anyway, it might as well come the way I want it. And so he gives them this parliament and they have some powers, but they have limited power over the military and very limited power over foreign policy, which of course he and the king control. And it keeps that military caste, which is really the beating heart of Prussia, in power. And this forms the basis, by the way, this Constitution of 1867 will be the basis for the German Empire in a few years. So what happens, now that we're getting into the 1870s, we're getting into what causes the Kulturkampf. He has one more battle to fight, does Bismarck. But before this happens, something happens that sets the rest of Europe again, kind of inflames it, and that is the First Vatican Council. This is one of the things that Pius IX has been building toward. The Ultramontane press, the Ultramontanes in the church, have been pushing for a definition of papal authority. They think it's necessary, right? All these upheavals, all these different states that are seemingly at the church's throat. They need to do something to stabilize society, and they think the church's authority needs to be pressed forward. And so they convene in 1869, the First Vatican Council, and they, of course, pass the dogmatic constitution eventually called Pastor Eternus, which defines dogmatically papal infallibility and papal primacy. And I can't stress this enough, the reaction from European and German diplomatic and political sources is really bad. It really offends, but it also kind of spooks a lot of Europe, because they, for a variety of reasons, they're afraid that what this means is the Pope is going to go out and start excommunicating politicians, start excommunicating kings like he did in the Middle Ages. If you remember some of the debates, some of the conflicts that happened in the Middle Ages, maybe you don't. It really spooks a lot of these European powers. They don't have representatives at the Vatican Council, but they are definitely paying attention. They have correspondents at the council who are giving them a blowdown on what's happening. And it will particularly inflame liberal opinion in Germany. And I'll come to this in a moment. This is very key for understanding why this happens. The one last thing that comes out of this is also feeds into the Kulturkampf, is the old Catholic schism. Because what happens is, if you don't know, the definition was very unpopular in Germany. Every single German bishop at the First Vatican Council votes against it. When they go back to Germany, there are hundreds of priests, laymen, who refuse to accept it, and they go into schism. It's called they form what's called the Old Catholic Church as a result of this. And so what happens, by the way, it starts while all this is going on, is Bismarck's last sort of gambit to create Germany, which is he provokes a war with France. If you don't know, France is still seen to be the behemoth of the continent in 1870. What happens to get France, to get them to take the bait? Because by this time, by the way, Prussia's military has been reformed. It's the best in Europe by far. His chief of staff, von Moltke, is a military genius. He knows he's going to beat France. That's why he wants them to start the war, so he can have perfect cover for it. And he provoked Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor of France at that point. He basically, the Spanish crown dies without an heir. They invite a German prince to take the throne. Bismarck instructs this German prince to take the throne because he knows the French will object. They do. They send an ambassador to Germany. He lectures the Germans on what they need to do. Bismarck records this transcript and then publishes it. With the intention of getting Louis Napoleon to bite, he does. He declares war first. 4 days later after this, in July 19th of 1870. And after a few small battles in August of that year, on September 1st of 1870, the Germans encircle the bulk of the French army at the Battle of Sedan, taking prisoner most of their troops, as well as Louis Napoleon himself. And for the next several months, from September 19th, 1870 to January 28th, 1871, they lay siege to Paris. Eventually, the French have to surrender. They're basically already done after the Battle of Sedan, but they hold out for a few months. An armistice is signed on March 1st, in which the French agree to pay a big indemnity to the Germans, to the Prussians. They also cede territory. This is important. The territory of Alsace and Lorraine to the Prussian state. And even before this happens, on January 18th of 1871, King William I of Prussia is proclaimed to be William I of the German Empire from the Palace of Versailles and the Hall of Mirrors. The Palace of Versailles, if you recall, is the Palace of Louis XIV. It's meant to be a maximum insult to the French. And so you had the creation at a stroke of this empire. They annexed the rest of the German states that are not already part of that confederation that were with them. And one of the things this Franco-Prussian War does is it basically spells the end of the Papal States. After the Italians had actually unified Italy in 1861, except for Rome, it was protected by French troops. As soon as the war with Prussia starts, the French withdraw the troops from Rome. As soon as they do, the Italian army moves in and surrounds Rome. For about 3 weeks, papal volunteers try to fight them off. But on September 19th, Pius IX decides there won't be more bloodshed, and he orders them to stand down. And they take over, and Rome becomes the capital of Italy. And the Vatican becomes, the Pope becomes, as Pius IX says, a prisoner in the Vatican, which they'll be for the next 50 or 60 years until they sign a concordat in the 1920s with the Italian fascist government. And one last thing about this, when they create this German Empire, when we think of the word empire, maybe you don't, I do as an American. I hate to say it, I tend to think of Star Wars, Darth Vader and this sort of, we're going to impose this stuff. The German Empire was not really an empire, anything like that. As you saw from that map, actually, could you show this? I think there's another map I wanted to show you. Yeah, I think this is Prussia before and after the Austro-Prussian War, in which they defeat the Austrians. They take over Hanover and these states here. And in 1866, if you move to the last one, the color one, just to show everybody, this is what the empire looks like in 1871. They've cobbled together all these states into one unified, contiguous area. This is Prussia here, Brandenburg, Prussia in the east. This is the eastern part over here. This is Berlin in the center. And down here, and I haven't pointed this out, these states that are down here are, not all of them, but various especially, is a Catholic state. Most of the Catholics are in the south and the west of the German territories. There are some spread out through the rest of them. But the north tends to be more Protestant. But you have all of these territories brought into one. However, a lot of these states have been independent for centuries, and Bismarck has to make a lot of compromises to get them to agree to all this. There are, within this empire, 4 kingdoms, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, 3 free cities, and probably a partridge in a pear tree, I guess. But the point is, it's not really one single state as of yet. And in fact, most of the powers actually lie in terms of administration with these states. There are limits to the powers of this new German state. Almost all the taxation revenue is collected by the individual states. There is, in terms of imperial government, there's the emperor, there's the chancellor, Bismarck, there's a federal council appointed by the emperor, and then you have the parliament. The upper house is the Bundesrat, which is appointed by the emperor, and the lower house, which is popularly elected, the Reichstag. And that is it. There is no imperial administration to speak of. So they're almost wholly dependent on these states to do things. And and I mention this because some scholars have suggested they lacked the policing power to sort of fully accomplish what they set out to do in the 1870s with the church. More than this state, in addition to being a very decentralized polity, is also a multi-ethnic state now. You saw on that map, Alsace-Lorraine, they just conquered it from the French. It's full of French Catholics who hate the Prussians, right? In the east, in what's called Silesia, it used to be part of Poland. There are a lot of Polish Catholics there. They don't like the Prussians either. There are Danes in the north from parts they had conquered there. It's not a totally unified culture now, which is a problem for Bismarck and his nationalist allies. They're very afraid that something could undermine this new, very brand new national unity they've just forged, right? And in particular, the thing that disturbs Bismarck the most, who, by the way, does have pretty standard anti-Catholic prejudices, But what really disturbs him is the Center Party. And what is the Center Party? It is a political party formed in 1870. And as its name implies, it's between the conservative parties, which are basically monarchists, which Bismarck basically controls, and on the right, and then on the left, the liberal parties, and then the Democratic. The Democrats are basically the precursors of the socialists. And the Center Party is a Catholic party. It's founded by Catholics to defend their interests. In 1870, they reach out to Protestants initially, but it's almost wholly a Catholic party. However, and they are, by the way, the party of what goes for that in the 1870s, states' rights. They stand for the smaller states against the centralizing tendencies of Bismarck and liberals. However, what makes the Center Party threatening for Bismarck is that it is a genuinely popular party. It includes Poles and French Alsatians and different people from all over the German states, from every German state. There are Catholics in most of these states now. And moreover, it is the only party that has members from every social class, from peasants, laborers, all the way up to nobility. In other words, it has potentially the power and the cohesion to use some of those limited powers the Reichstag possesses to undermine that revolution from above he spent so much time building. And so, why? And then this is really why this Bismarck sort of embarked on this campaign. This is his main concern. He tells the Prussian cabinet in the fall of 1871 that, quote, from the Russian border of the Adriatic Sea, we are confronted with a combined propaganda of Slavs, ultramontanes, and reactionaries, and it is necessary openly to defend our national interests and our language against such hostile activities. You have to understand, you talked about language there, these nation states in the 19th century are trying to create self-governed societies, and having a single language where everybody communicates is actually a fairly new thing. In places like France, for example, for a long time, they speak in very different dialects. And it's only by the end of the 19th century they've imposed one single Parisian dialect of French across all these states. So it's a concern for Bismarck. And so what he's afraid of, by the way, is he's afraid of this ultramontane Catholic Church sort of using its authority to stir up these ethnic minorities in his state. And it's not crazy. He's wrong. They weren't trying to do that, but he's afraid of this. It's very different with his liberal allies. Quite frankly, his liberal allies have been inflamed by Pastor Eternus in the First Vatican Council, and they simply hate the Catholic Church. When I say liberals, by the way, most people in the liberal parties, they're mostly Protestants. There are a few secular politicians in 19th century Germany. They're mostly Protestants. Although the most conservative, quote unquote, Protestants are in the conservative parties, but they're mostly Protestants. There is a confessional element to this. They hate the church, to be blunt. One of these liberals claims that the Declaration of Papal Infallibility was, quote, a death sentence, unquote, for the modern state. They see Catholicism, in the words of one historian, as the, quote, absolute negation of their worldview, unquote. In speeches in the Reichstag, in books, in academic articles, in newspapers and pamphlets, liberal academics, politicians, and journalists made clear they see ultramontane Catholicism as a dire threat to the unity of the German state, but also to civilization itself. They see in Catholicism the epitome of tyranny and superstition and ignorance and the opposition to science and freedom and all the other good things. And if you're wondering, by the way, how liberals who are supposed to be dedicated to individual rights and things like this justify what they're about to do, with there's a few exceptions, but most of them have no problem doing this. They justify using state power to try to curb the church because they thought it was necessary to meet this threat. Their reasoning is that you can only be free if you can't be free if there's an institution like the Catholic Church, which is opposed to freedom, being able to influence society. So you have to use state power to break it. As one of these liberals put it, quote, we should remove from it, the church, the Catholic Church, the privileges that it had always used to the detriment of the freedom of the people, the independence of government life, confessional peace, and the progress of all human cultivation, unquote. These liberals thought that the modern state demanded absolute loyalty, and that quote, within its borders, the state had to be totally autonomous and omnipotent, according to one of them, unquote. Catholics who did not swear allegiance to the modern state were, quoting another liberal, quote, slaves to the curia, unquote. And this is what necessitated state coercion in things like education. As one of these liberals put it, these liberal politicians put it, quote, the German state forces parents to educate their children. It does not give them the right to their Catholic idiocy. And one last thing about this liberal worldview we have here. Both Bismarck, but especially liberals, saw this attack on Catholicism as a continuation of the wars they fought in the 1860s and then 1870 against the French. As in the previous case, they were fighting the external enemies of the state. Now they're going to fight the internal enemies of the state. And liberals, in pretty much every way, shape, and form, in every type of writing, they will use martial language, martial metaphors to refer to this campaign against the church. The term Kulturkampf, excuse me, we get the title of this lecture from, was coined by a sociologist named Ferdinand Lassalle, but a progressive politician in the Reichstag, Rudolf Virchow, was the one who popularized it. He's the one in a speech arguing for one of these pieces of legislation in 1872, said that they were engaged in a Kulturkampf, which means a civilizational struggle, a culture struggle, a culture war with the Catholic Church. You had these irreconcilable cultures that had to fight it out to see who would win. Emil Friedeberg, who was one of the drafters of the infamous May Laws of 1873, which we'll talk about in a second, said of Catholicism that it was the state's duty, quote, to suppress it, to destroy it, to crush it with violence, unquote. And throughout this whole period of years, liberal newspapers, whether secular in nature or Protestant, they routinely print cartoons depicting Bismarck as a knight or a crusader, putting down, like in some of them, they predict a black army. The black army is the Jesuits, right? Everybody hates the Jesuits. So that's a universal thing. But it's put in this, it's almost like a crusade to some of these politicians. And Bismarck, again, fearing their power, thinks he can get away with trying to crush them legally because he has liberals on his side. And so this finally begins to get to the actual Kulturkampf. In 1870, the Vatican had been having diplomatic back and forth with Bismarck. Bismarck wanted the Vatican's help in trying to basically curb the ambitions of the Center Party. The Center Party had been critical of his policies. He wanted the Vatican to, restrain them, and Pius IX was cool to this. And so 1870, one of the first things that is done, I should stress here, most of this takes place at the state level. It happens all over Germany. The worst of it happens in Prussia, so that's why I'm focusing on this. Prussian government abolishes in 1870, there's a Ministry of Education. They had a special Catholic bureau just for Catholics. They abolish it. And this sort of marks the opening volley of hostilities. At the end of 1871, they pass what's called a pulpit law, which punishes criticism of the state by clerics who, quote, treat state matters in a manner that threatens the public peace. And I should mention here, when I say clerics, I don't mean that laws don't say Catholic priests, they say clerics. But what they really mean is Catholic priests. Much of this legislation will say things like that, but they will tell Protestant churches, we're not aiming at you, we are aiming at the Catholic Church. Early the next year, Bismarck appoints the liberal politician Adalbert Falk as Minister of Education and Public Worship. This sends a signal because he is known to be an anti-Catholic bigot. And in March, the Landtag, which is the Prussian parliament, passes a law subjecting all religious schools to state inspection and allowing for the removal of priests or clerics from the role of state inspectors, which again, this is aimed, it says clerics in the law, they tell Protestant inspectors, it doesn't apply to you. They start removing Catholic inspectors in schools and replacing them, by the way, and you'll see this happens again in other settings, with old Catholics. Remember, they're old Catholic, they're priests who have gone to schism. They will use them in this Kulturkampf to try to break the church in several ways. That same year, Bismarck tried to appoint a cardinal as ambassador to the Vatican. One of the cardinals who'd been a critic at Vatican I, and who Pius IX despised. Pius IX refused to receive him as an ambassador. And Bismarck, in response to this, in a speech in May, made a famous declaration declaring that he would never give in to Vatican demands, said that, quote, there is only one sovereignty, the sovereignty of the law. We shall not go to Canossa, neither in body nor in spirit, unquote. And he's, of course, referring to the medieval conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, and the Pope at the time, Henry VII, and sort of laying down the gauntlet. And Bismarck keeps pressing the Vatican. He asked them that later that year to censure the Center Party, to restrain them publicly. In response, Pius, as his Secretary of State, issued a public statement in support of the Center Party. And it's really in June of 1872 things get really nasty, because that's when the Prussian Parliament passes a law banning all religious orders from education whatsoever in the state of Germany. The Jesuits, the Lazarists, and the Redemptorists are all expelled from German soil and required to leave within 6 months. By the end of the year, some 500 Jesuits have left as a result. Both the Center Party and the Episcopate highly criticized these laws as a breach of the Constitution. And the bishops forbid Catholics to sort of assist with the carrying out any of these laws. And at this point, especially this law really triggers popular passions. You start to have protests for and against these laws. I mentioned the Jesuits weren't popular, so that's why. But you have both Protestants and Catholics organizing protests, organizing petition drives. And you have this, again, you have this feeling in the air that the Reformation's almost come back. In February of 1872, a social democrat politician speaking to a group of workers in Dresden tells them, quote, one feels that one has been transported back into the wildest years after the Reformation. So widespread is the quarreling of religion, unquote. Later that year in August, when the police in the city of Essen try to close down and lock up a Jesuit residence, they will clash with Catholic protesters on the street who try to reopen the Jesuit chapel by force. Eventually, fighting breaks out, and it gets so bad, they have to send 2 battalions of the Prussian army into the city to put down the riots. By year's end, Pius IX issues an allocution to his curia where he condemns the efforts of the Roman Empire to persecute the church, saying that it amounted to, quote, an attempt to eliminate Catholicism in the new German Empire, unquote. Bismarck, at that point, finally severs diplomatic ties with Rome and says, no more, we're going to go ahead with this. And so the next year, you have the passage of the so-called May Laws in the Landtag. And they are notorious because they modify the Prussian Constitution. The Prussian Constitution of 1850 actually guaranteed the Catholic Church some sort of autonomy, but this modifies it. And it imposes some interesting things here, as you can see in a second. It requires all Catholic seminarians to be German nationals. It requires them to study for 3 years in a German university. It requires them to submit to state examinations in German literature, history, and philosophy. So they're obviously thinking about Polish Catholics with that issue there. But it also begins to subject clerical appointments by bishops to government oversight and veto. It also places restrictions on episcopal powers of excommunication and discipline. And finally, it establishes what it calls a court of ecclesiastical affairs as the final tribunal to hear appeals from priests. In other words, it's basically saying that the state is now the final canonical tribunal in the state. It's basically meant to sort of cut the head off of the church in Germany and cut it off from Rome at the same time. That year, Pius IX tells a deputation from Naples that he feels like the persecution in Germany is worse than that of Nero, because the former was open and honest, while that in Germany takes place, quote, under the veil of law, unquote. Pius tries his best to use diplomacy to ease the people's suffering in Germany. He writes to Wilhelm I, asking him as monarch to do something about this, but he refuses. He says these laws are necessary for national unity. He writes about this around the same time the Jesuit law is being passed, which again, everybody's for in Germany, and so he refuses. The German bishops issue a statement unanimously declaring they will not acknowledge the May laws or assist in their implementation. And Pius IX issues an encyclical in that November, Et si multa, in which he backs them up and encourages Catholics to persevere. Meanwhile, Adalbert Falk begins fining, arresting, and imprisoning priests who refuse to cooperate with the laws. And in certain circumstances, by the way, either just leaving the parishes vacant without a priest or replacing them with old Catholic priests. So they are beginning to sort of literally take control of the church there. And things finally begin to really escalate to their worst zenith in 1874 and 1875. The next year, Falk also turns laws against the bishops. A second set of May laws is passed in 1874, which makes recalcitrant bishops and priests liable to deposition and exile. The Bishop of Munster was fined so often that after several fines, all he had left was his furniture, which was then confiscated. They began confiscating, by the way, to pay for these fines, pretty much as much ecclesiastical property as they can get their hands on. Archbishop Ledakowski of Posen is imprisoned for resisting the law against teaching the catechism in Polish to his Polish plot. The Bishop of Trier was in prison for 9 months, and then he died 6 months later after going to prison. Priests are exiled from their parishes. Sometimes, by the way, they'll come back illegally to minister to their parishioners. Others will go on the run, disguised as peasants, to try to avoid capture. And the persecution also affects lay Catholics as well. As soon as they expel the religious orders, the parish missions almost cease entirely in 1872. The Prussian government cracks down on pilgrimages. Local officials are ordered to make lists of all Catholic associations, lay Catholic associations, who their leaders are, who their members are, what their aims are. Dozens, if not hundreds of them, are shut down over a several-year period. And yet, this doesn't actually work. What it's intended to do, of course, is basically separate laity from the clergy and the priesthood from the bishops. But it doesn't work. Bishops will defy the government and appoint pastors illegally when they're not supposed to, who will be aided by their parishioners to avoid authorities. When the government will seize Episcopal property, what they'll do is they'll sell it at auction. What Catholics will wind up doing, lay Catholics, is organizing and pooling their money and buy it back and give it back to the bishop. And most importantly, in all of this, despite what the government is doing, there is still, of course, a popular assembly, the Reichstag. And when they have elections in 1874, the Center Party wins big. It increases its numbers both in the German Imperial Reichstag, but also in the Prussian Parliament as well. And so it's seen as kind of a repudiation, a defiance of Bismarck, who responds in kind, by the way, when a Catholic, Edward Cullen, in 1874, in July, attempts to assassinate him. He misses at that point. And in the Reichstag, the Center Party claimed they didn't have anything to do with it, obviously. But he taunted them. He said, quote, "Cast the man out as you like. He hangs on your coattails after all," tries to smear them with the attempt, and pushes forward. And things get to their worst, probably their nadir, in 1875. That year, in the first 4 months of 1875, some 241 priests, 136 Catholic newspaper editors, 210 Catholic laymen are all fined or imprisoned. 20 newspapers are confiscated. 74 Catholic houses are searched. 103 political activists are expelled or interned. And 55 Catholic associations or clubs are closed down. So it gets most intense by this year. Pius IX still is trying to do what he can. He issues another encyclical in 1875, declaring the May laws null and void, threatening any Catholic who participates in their enforcement with excommunication. The German government will fire back a circular letter accusing the Pope of claiming to be a, quote, perfectly absolute monarch. And the German bishops will issue their own letter basically denying this, which Pius IX will also support. And that year, they finally passed two more sort of Kulturkampf laws. In February, civil marriage is made obligatory. So civil marriage is made at that point, the law of the land. But they also passed the so-called breadbasket law of 1875 in April, which permits the state to suspend all financial grants to dioceses where the laws are not being obeyed. So, and in May, finally, all religious except those engaged in hospital work are expelled from the country. So you have this several-year campaign of trying to literally take control of the church in terms of, clerical appointments, stuff like this. Peaks in 1875. By 1877, there are thousands of parishes that have no pastors. And by 1877, 9 of the 12 Prussian bishops are in exile. So it's a pretty thorough trying to cut the head off of the snake. But it kind of stalls after 1875. No new legislation is passed after 1875. And this has to be credited to the leader, by the way, of the Center Party, guy named Ludwig Windthorst. He was actually one German historian called him, quote, the most brilliant parliamentarian in German history. He was, dealt a sort of difficult hand, but he deserves credit here. He was never able to fully turn back the tide of all of this stuff, but with his efforts to cobble together coalitions in the Reichstag, he manages to keep things open with the left and right. And on issues that are not related to the Kulturkampf, he manages to thwart Bismarck several ways and keeps it from going any further. But by 1875, you also have increasing concern even among Bismarck's allies, especially his conservative allies. There are conservative Lutherans in his orbit who are kind of afraid of all this. They don't really care about the Catholic Church, but they're afraid this will come back on them. But this is turning into not just an attack on the church, but an attack on religion. And even Wilhelm I is said to have wondered aloud after the Prussian state made civil marriage the law of the land, whether baptism would be next. So there is this sense of there's a diminishing returns on the back of all of this. But in the end, nothing really happens for about 3 years, and Catholic resistance basically grinds this to a halt, is what's responsible for this. And what happens is Bismarck, who is a canny politician, realizes this. And so in 1878, with the death of Pius IX, nothing would have happened with Pius alive, I think. The election of Leo XIII, he quietly opens negotiations with Leo XIII to end the strife. The next year, he dismisses Adalbert Falk as Prussian Minister of Education. He gives the successor discretion to ameliorate the worst of the May laws. Full diplomatic relations are restored with the Vatican in 1882. But the Kulturkampf laws take a long time to repeal. It takes about a dozen years to finally get negotiations where everything's sort of undone. By the early 1890s, they're basically gone in Prussia. By the end of the 1880s, they're gone in the other parts of Germany, except for the anti-Jesuit laws. They are still on the books until World War I, until 1917. Again, nobody likes the Jesuits, so this is what happens with all this stuff. So it kind of ends with a sort of whimper, the Kulturkampf. It doesn't work. But it does a lot of damage to Catholicism. By the end of 1878, there were more than 1,800 German Catholic priests who had been incarcerated or exiled. The government had seized over 16 million marks, German marks worth of property. And as late as 1881, 1/4 of all Prussian parishes remained without priests. So it's a real serious, heavy cost the church paid for resisting all this. And I'll mention this briefly in passing. I want to kind of get this to the end so you can ask questions, but this is the stuff I've covered is mostly in Germany. This also happened in what I'm calling Greater Germany. There's a Kulturkampf, as it were, in Switzerland. There's also, and of all places, Austria, which is a good Catholic country. During the 1870s, there are some of these attempts to gain control of the church. I can go through that if you'd like, if you have questions about it, but I'll skim over it here. Bismarck, having failed to subjugate totally the church, turns on the socialists next. He abandons the liberals. He goes back to his conservative allies. He passes a law. They pass a law in 1879 banning the Socialist Party. He tries to break their power. He tries to buy them off, by the way. He basically creates the welfare state, and I'm serious. They passed the first social insurance laws, workers' comp type stuff to try to woo the socialists. Doesn't work. He's eventually pushed out in 1890, and the Socialist Party gets legalized. One last thing about this is that, for the most part, people think the Kulturkampf was a failure. What's interesting about this, however, is recent German scholarship seems to be more favorable to Bismarck. And the reason for this, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, this Kulturkampf is part of a wider campaign where the church is fighting on a bunch of fronts to try to retain control over marriage in certain countries, try to contain control over education, in which it ultimately fails. And in fact, there's another reason for this, is that Bismarck couldn't break the church. However, one of the lasting consequences of this in Germany, the Kulturkampf, is that the church in Germany basically retreats into its own separate world. The Catholic Church, because one of the legacies is increased, even in an increasingly secular Germany, Protestant practice goes down. There are still serious confessional tensions, but the church starts building a sort of separate world of separate, you name it, newspapers, publishing houses, play theaters, everything, a sort of separate society away from everything else. And in fact, by the time you get to the early 20th century, some people in the Center Party, but also in the more in the literary intellectual world of German Catholicism, get tired of this stuff. And I mention this because there's a famous pamphlet published in 1906 by a Center Party member, the title of which was "We Must Get Out of the Tower," by which he meant we have to cease being a merely Catholic party. We have to reach out to Protestants. We have to reach out across the aisle and branch out, broaden its base. And in 1903, there was a literary journal named Hochland, formed in 1903, which had similar concerns in intellectual and literary terms. They wanted to break out of this small Catholic world and talk to the wider world. It is from this milieu, and the guy who founds Hochland's a guy named Carl Muth. I thought I had the reference somewhere, but I think he coined the term Catholic ghetto. If it wasn't him, it comes from this circle of people. They want to get out of the Catholic ghetto and be part of the wider world. You may have heard that term because it was picked up by David Tracy Ellis, an American priest and historian in the 1950s, who criticized American Catholics for living in their Catholic ghetto. They need to get out and open themselves to the world and all this stuff. And my point is, some of these people in Hochland were kind of on the fringes of the modernist movement. I remember the modernists. And this idea that the church needs to open itself to the world is very prominent in German Catholicism. Before the Second Vatican Council, it kind of feeds into that. That's one of the legacies of the Kulturkampf, is it created this reaction where the church had to separate itself, and then it created another reaction that I think was that had an influence later on. Well, the question is this relevant to? Are we going through a Kulturkampf now? That was part of the lecture outline I gave you. And there's a book on there you should take a look at. It's almost 40 years old. God, I'm getting old. It's published by James Davis and Hunter in 1991. It's called Culture Wars. And that's the term, of course, that's the translation in some way, one way of translating Kulturkampf. And Hunter is an evangelical Protestant and a sociologist who was writing about, of course, all the conflicts that we have had in the United States since the 1960s over, well, things like education, things like marriage, but also tons of other cultural issues. And he makes the point that there are big differences between the cultural conflicts we have now and with the Kulturkampf in Germany. I'll just mention a few differences. I call them discontinuities on the outline. One of the things about the Kulturkampf, it was pretty much it was drawn along confessional lines. I mentioned that. Even though there are some, people like Ludwig Windthorst who have Protestant friends, nobody really crosses lines. It's Catholics fighting with Catholics. It's Protestants fighting with Protestants. There's only one exception to that in the entire German-speaking world. There's one instance in Switzerland in the 1880s where Catholics and Protestants will join sides. Of course, today in the contemporary America, That's very different because the culture wars run within and between confessions. And I'm sure probably a lot of you have friends who are, I have friends who are conservative Anglicans, conservative Protestants, and you have more in common with them than you do with certain members who are, of the Catholic Church. And so that's a big difference. Another difference is that one of the things that's happening in the 19th century is, they're fighting over control of marriage and education are the Catholics and the Protestants in Germany. Nobody's fighting over the definition of what marriage is or what education is. Control of culture was what they're fighting over in the 19th century. We're fighting over what a man is or what a woman is and stuff like this. So it's much more radical, the things that are going on. There's a few other things I can mention, but there are a lot of discontinuities. There are some continuities, however, between what was happening then and now. One is the sort of, I don't know if it's a return, it's never really gone away, but a sort of militant liberalism that was sort of on the rampage in the late 19th century. And this, I think, again, it's not anti-clerical per se, it's a little more anti-religion in general, but similar in that regard. It's probably a lot more secular than it was in the 19th century, but those are still drivers. One other thing that's similar, I mentioned this in the lecture, is that newspapers had a lot to do with stoking the flames of the culture war of the 19th century in Germany. I think we can say that media in general has a lot to do with that in the modern age as well. But they are connected to a certain degree, although they're with the way we have. With the way our media works today, it's almost as if the culture war is a continuous, universal thing. It never goes away. You can't retreat into your corner like the Catholics did in Germany in the 19th century. But it's instructive because, of course, despite all the other continuity I'll end with is that state power is still an issue in a lot of this, because ultimately the state is still what can force things on people and what can sort of people can use to fight these battles. So that is it. I'm sorry, I'm done. You can ask questions now. My take on the Kulturkampf.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for such a great evening together and so much information on this topic and learning how to take it in and how to break it down. For those of you taking notes tonight, if you're anything like me, taking notes in rapid fashion, one thing that I love to say is that we record all of this and put it in our library. So take it in for the first time, go and watch it again when it's posted. There's plenty of time for you to take it all in. We are going to dive into some questions and answers here. We are going to go ahead. Anna, at the top of the screen, please go ahead, take yourself off of mute and ask your question for Dr. Taylor.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank ICC staff because all these classes that we've been taking kind of culminate together. And with Dr. Taylor's presentation today, you really see how all the connections take place. Being of Prussian heritage, this is a definitely very interesting fact for me to learn more about my heritage. And I just wanted to ask about, you can see where the revolution of the United States, the unification of Italy with Garibaldi, the unification of South America with Simon Bolivar, they all kind of lead into this point with Germany trying to unite. And my question to you is that I think Bismarck did find out that it was a problem getting rid of the Catholics because the biggest issue that they were dealing with, I think, at that time was the Communist Manifesto and also the breakdown of monarchy. Nobody likes change. So my question to you is, how do you feel that like the student revolts of 1848 and all these other sidelines that were going on in history at the time, because it goes to show us that we don't learn from history. History keeps repeating itself.
Well, you had, I mean, you had this, one of the things that happens with these revolutions is that they can build a momentum. Like people, you're overthrowing a government that seems so powerful and large. People get this, to explain why liberals would want to go try to wipe out the church. It doesn't, in retrospect, it seems like most scholars think it was a stupid idea anyway. The reason is victory tends to get people to dream big, to get things to go to their head and begin having some utopian, dreams about things. The revolution of 1848, you mentioned the student protesters were a part of that. and they had very idealistic notions about what they could achieve. And so, but for some of these revolutionaries, it almost kind of feeds on itself, the revolutionary experience. Like it leads them to want to do more and to tear down more things. But there's a real, I don't think maybe I quoted this. I think there was a historian I came across that, yeah, I think I did. The way to describe those revolutionaries, the really militant liberals, I think the term he used was intolerant and totalitarian. There is a very, revolutionaries can get really crazy. And that's kind of what happens with some of these when they're successful, they can get out of hand really quickly. So I don't know if that answers your question. If there's anything else you follow up, I'll try to answer it, but thank you.
Dr. Taylor, we have a question coming in. Someone wrote in asking as far as how Kulturkampf like affected very practically the church internationally. Is there historical evidence that the Kulturkampf caused German Catholics to migrate or immigrate over to the United States? How did it affect the movement of Catholics internationally?
I don't know in broad picture how it did it. I know they did immigrate during that time period. It's funny you asked that question. I don't know if anybody here lives in the state of Kansas. I lived in the Kansas City area for a long time, and if you go out to Dodge City, there are a lot of ghost towns in Kansas, towns that like they were built expecting the railroad to come by and it didn't. They kind of died. There's an old settlement there that was founded by German Catholics from Bavaria in 1876. And it was called Windhorst, Kansas, and it was named after Ludwig Windhorst, the Center Party leader. If you go out, by the way, if you ever have a chance to go out there, there was a community that stayed there. They moved to another place. There's a gorgeous German church that still exists there. It's kept up. Like the town's disappeared. The high school used to be a Catholic school. It's all gone. But they banded their money to keep. I've been out there is what I'm saying. I discovered while I was out there. It's this beautiful Bavarian, pink marble, this German churches. And so to answer your question, it probably did a little bit. I don't think it did too much. I mean, I don't know is the honest answer, but it did at least some of them drive some of them out. I'm certain, to be fair.
Great. Thank you so much. Paul on screen, go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask your question for Dr. Taylor.
Thank you for taking my question. Dr. Taylor, question for you in regards to the change in culture. So seems very targeted towards the Catholic Church. And there's been some enemies of the church for several centuries. And I'm wondering what your thoughts would be in terms of enemies of like mysticism or occultism, Freemasonry, things of this nature. How much do you think those things would have influenced the culture to be so anti-Catholic?
I tend to be, in the 19th century, more so than now. I think it probably did have some influence. Like I know, and by the way, at one point during the Kulturkampf, I know that a Catholic mob attacked a Freemason temple at one point. So they thought it did anyway. But in the 19th century, I actually wrote about this for Crisis Magazine a few weeks ago. The Masons did have a revolutionary effect in the 19th century. Giuseppe Mazzini was an Italian revolutionary, one of the people who started the Risorgimento. He created an organization called Young Italy, which is dedicated to unifying the Italian peninsula. It started in Freemason lodges. So it definitely had an impact there. I don't know, Bismarck was a Freemason apparently, so doesn't surprise me. It would have, in the 19th century, I believe it probably did. I don't know about, again, particularly the Kulturkampf, but in the 19th century it did. I'm much more skeptical about today, mainly because, they're actually if you go to actual Freemason websites, they're very honest. It's basically a dying institute. And they basically say, yeah, we're losing. They're quite open about it. It's kind of refreshing. But in the 19th century, probably to a certain degree. Although this is most people pinpoint Bismarck as the person who actually pushed this. And so if he was in Freemason, so maybe there's some of that there. I don't know in terms of his other motives.
Dr. Taylor, we have so many questions coming in the backside, and I'm going to kind of give you a topic, and you can maybe share just a couple thoughts on it. So many people are writing in asking about the Kulturkampf and the influence of the Protestant Reformation and Lutheran, and the involvement or reaction with that, if there's any interplay in that. So if you can just give us maybe a thought or two on that, we'll answer several questions that have come in on that.
Sure, it comes up. People will refer to the Reformation, they'll refer to Luther on the Protestant side. I don't get the sense it's actually that important to them. I think what's happening is this is more cultural than a religious conflict in a way. Having said all that, if I could read German, it would help a lot. There's a big English language scholarship on this. My sense from reading what I have read, though, is the Protestants generally tend to be the ones who are liberal and more gung-ho for this, more on the either pietist evangelical side or liberal Protestants. It seemed like the most conservative Lutherans didn't really like this. And if you know anything about Lutheranism, there is a sort of spectrum. There's more quote unquote conservative who they're a little bit closer to Catholicism in some ways. And I got the sense that there was a spectrum where this was more intense than other places, but I don't get a sense they were like, this isn't for the Reformation, this is for the state. German unity is the most important thing. Although that includes being Protestant, it does include that, yeah. I mean, Catholicism is this alien thing, and they do want to at least control it if they can't stamp it out. So it's there, it's just not the primary motivation, I think.
Great, thank you. Father, up on screen, go ahead and take yourself off of mute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Doctor, when you were talking about the Kulturkampf, it seemed very similar to what Lenin did in the Russian Empire, and especially in Ukraine and Western Ukraine. It was this idea of separating the people from the church, having the marriage be civil. To this day, they still have all the Soviet bloc still has a separate civil and religious ceremony. Is not recognized. The religious not recognized. I was just wondering, how much do you think that I looked it up while we were speaking, that Marx and Engels died right about the time at the peak of the Kulturkampf. How much do you think that they influenced probably Lenin, who was probably hitting his prime then?
Mm-hmm. There's a sort of spectrum. This is kind of what I want to get at here, is that sometimes, at least I guess it's an Anglophone thing, like we think of liberalism as being this hands-off, not very aggressive. If you know anything about the history of continental Europe, liberalism there is much more aggressive. And your point, Father, about like how much does it affect communism? It's got a lot in common with. Anti-clericalism is common to liberalism and very common to liberalism in 19th century Europe, and therefore is on the same sort of spectrum as communism in a lot of ways. Again, they have serious differences, but in some ways, at least in its anti-clericalism, Marx is just the sort of more radical version, takes it to its most logical extreme. But I tell you, I did not know about the rhetoric of the Kulturkampf till I prepared for this lecture as well as I did. And it is fire breathing. They talk like they want to wipe the church from the face of the earth. And so I don't know how much the big thing is, of course, Marx promoted violence much more directly. That's true. Commies like violence more than liberals, but there's a lot of similar sentiments. So I'd say it's sort of like the Kulturkampf on steroids, right? Because they did, the Soviets did, the Bolsheviks did this is a thing historians raise. If the Germans had a more developed centralized government, would it have succeeded? I think it probably would have. I think if they'd had more power, they didn't really have like an imperial, there was no state really. If they'd had with the Soviets, I think it might have worked. So to answer your question, I think it's just a sort of more intense, a more logical development of what's at work, at least in the very secular part, especially the secularizing part of the Kulturkampf, because I don't think, I know I made Bismarck sound like a crazy person, which he kind of was. His nickname was the Mad Junker, by the way. But he wasn't necessarily somebody who would just do things to do them. He would have stopped. He did stop. So to the liberals were the ones who were disappointed really by the end of the Kulturkampf. They really wanted to get the church. So to sum it up, I think it's just the more logical, the more extreme version of similar anti-clerical ideas. And done much, and Lenin was just a brutal person, just much more, a sort of dehumanized person, if you want to put it that way. Just brutal. Hope that answers your question.
Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for being here with us. I feel like we could just keep going all evening. It's such a, like you keep referencing to such a broad spectrum of ideas and so much information to take in on this. We really appreciate the time that you've taken with us this evening in lecturing and in answering these questions for us. If you would please close us in prayer this evening.
Sure. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Lord, we give you thanks for being here together to listen and speak with each other and hopefully learn from the past and learn to live according to the words of your Son, your divine Son, with the aid of his blessed mother and all the saints. And we praise you and you thank you in Jesus' name. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.